All right, so I'll get started. Thank you very much. I am delighted at the opportunity to get to talk to you about my research on language science and bilingualism. I've heard a lot of good things about this group, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts and comments during the discussion. Okay, so my general plan for today is to walk you through a story that I've been trying to put together, focusing on the behavioral ecology of bilingual speakers from different language environments. Okay, so to set the stage with a little bit of context, I view language as a form of communicative action with different levels of control demands. And so in our everyday interactions, we must not only monitor the immediate context, but also activate and maintain relevant lexical and grammatical constructions, all the while resisting interference from competing alternatives. In the case of bilingual speakers, the active use of more than one language means navigating a relatively more complex landscape. Now, over the past 30 years or so, we've made great strides in the field in the ways we think about bilingualism and language experience. And I know this might sound obvious, especially to this crowd in particular, but among these milestones, a key discovery has been that bilingualism is a complex life experience, that not all bilinguals are the same. We now know that bilingualism takes different forms in different contexts around the world. And for that very reason, even though it's more parsimonious to assume that bilingualism in and of itself will result in a particular outcome or pattern of response, that's likely not going to be true for many scenarios. Okay. And so it follows that a better understanding of bilingualism requires a framework for characterizing that complexity. And long story short, the message of this talk is that bilingualism needs to be understood in context. Okay. So this goes without saying, but this is indeed a transdisciplinary collaborative endeavor. We need to cross those disciplinary boundaries. And so before I get started, I wanted to quickly acknowledge that this work is in large part thanks to this network of wonderful people who recognize that precisely this value of crossing these traditional disciplinary boundaries. So how do we go about characterizing language experience? It's certainly easier said than done, right? But the question that I like for you to think about throughout the talk is how different interactional experiences may be differentially tuning how bilinguals are drawing on cognitive resources during language processing. And so for a given language environment, we can ask a series of questions, such as what is the relative support for each language? Are bilinguals primarily immersed in their first language or in their second language? We can ask questions about their habits of language use. That is, are bilinguals habitually code switching, using their languages interchangeably in conversation? Or do they prefer to keep them separate, right? Using just one language in each particular situation. And third, we can consider the contextual diversity of the environment and ask the extent to which bilinguals are surrounded by other individuals who are similarly bilingual, okay? And the logic with this last point is that bilinguals in more linguistically diverse environments are more likely to experience a greater variety of communicative demands relative to those in more homogeneous settings, okay? So you can imagine asking these series of questions across different contexts, giving rise to all sorts of variability in language experience. And what I'd like to showcase today is that by leveraging this experiential variation, we can attempt to identify bilingual phenotypes. And in doing so, discover, ideally, insights into potential boundary conditions on so-called more general bilingualism effects. Okay. To this point, once we've characterized different contexts of language use, and the demands that they may place on speakers to use their languages, we can consider how the language system is controlled in ways that reflect those demands. So in this talk, I'm going to show how bilinguals may adopt different modes of control for distinct communicative goals, okay? And so one useful way to think about this is in terms of the interactional cost of switching between languages. So on the one end of the spectrum, so when bilinguals are interacting with a monolingual interlocutor or in situations where code switching is sociopragmatically inappropriate, bilinguals need to stick to using just one language in conversation. And in such scenarios, there's a high cost of switching between languages. So the idea here is that language control necessarily needs to be engaged competitively to exploit that target language. Okay. Conversely, on the other end of the spectrum, when the interactional cost is low, bilinguals may resort to use either of their languages interchangeably, and this establishes a more cooperative relation between their languages. Now, in my research thus far, I've identified 3 paths of influence to adaptive change in bilingual speakers. I'll be focusing primarily on the first 2 for the sake of time, but plan to wrap up more generally with a discussion about bilingual phenotypes, okay? So let's start off with competitive language context. In these environments, the L1 is typically the predominant language, and the L2 is restricted to more exclusive communicative contexts, for example, at work or with a specific group of people. And because the languages are kept separate and used across different social settings, bilinguals in competitive contexts also tend to have little to no code switching experience. And so here I'm showing you some data from a corpus of Spanish-English bilinguals from different language environments. We have bilinguals from Granada in Spain, bilinguals from El Paso, Texas, State College, Pennsylvania, and San Juan, Puerto Rico. They're all highly proficient Spanish-English bilinguals. They're just living in different environments with different experiences. And as you can see here, the rates of code switching across these bilingual communities differs quite drastically. And I'll be referring to this plot several times throughout the talk, but for now, I'd like to orient your attention to the first bar. Okay, so these are Spanish-English bilinguals from Spain, particularly in Andalusia, which is a pretty monolingual autonomous region of the country. Their habits of language use pretty much fall into the description I just said about the competitive environment, right? They typically keep their languages separate. They don't habitually switch. Now, based off this characterization, we can now think about the ways in which competitive language experience may influence language processing, okay? And so to start, one consequence of increased competitive experience is that, as I said before, there's a high interactional cost for switching between languages in conversation, okay? And so to show you some evidence, here's an example of a study that we did in Spain, where we had these highly proficient Spanish-English bilinguals whose production data you saw in the previous graph. So they're highly proficient in the 2 languages, they just don't habitually switch them. And so we did an ERP study where we looked at their brain responses processing the 2 languages separately. So I'm going to show you their brain responses to unilingual sentences in Spanish and in English, time-locked to that word in bold here. So these are translation equivalent sentences. And as you can see, when the languages are kept separate, there's no difference in processing, right? They're processed the same. And this, again, speaks to their high level of proficiency in the 2 languages. Now, what happens when these same bilinguals process code-switched speech? Okay. So here is an example of, technically this is a baseline. The switch doesn't occur until after the target noun. So this is still technically unilingual. And what we see now here is the actual code switch. And so what we found for this group is an early frontal positivity switch effect. And in the study, we had different types of switches and it didn't matter. So regardless of the type of switch, every time there was a switch from Spanish into English, this elicited this early frontal positivity switch effect. Now, what seems to be going on? Well, given that for these bilinguals, code switching is not part of their linguistic repertoire, we have the production data to also substantiate that. This early effect may be associated with a reactive shift in attentional scope, right? From one language to like, oh, wait a second, we've changed languages, right? So the way that we interpreted this effect is that for individuals who tend to engage language control competitively, code switching may elicit a broadening of the scope of attention in order to process an unexpected change in language, okay? So when we start thinking about adaptive responses associated with competitive context, another idea is that this experience is also characterized by a greater tendency to engage control reactively, okay? And so the rationale for this is that because, again, the two languages are used separately across distinct communicative contexts, bilinguals can therefore generate very strong expectations about which language will occur at any given time. So here's, for example, a scenario of two friends in Spain just catching up over a casual afternoon over some coffee, and they're just speaking Spanish as they normally would. If they're at home, they would also speak Spanish as they normally would. And it's only where there's some sort of unexpected change. So, for example, interacting with an international student or a tourist or something like that, where these language expectations are not met, right? And so such circumstances may arguably trigger a reactive shift in attention to that less expected language. So how can we go about studying this? To test this possibility, we did the study where we examined associations between the AX continuous performance test and bilingual picture naming. So I believe many of you may be familiar with the task, but just in case, this is a task that measures people's tendencies to engage control either proactively or reactively as needed. And so in this version of the task, it's set up so that you see sequences of these letters, a cue and a probe, and the task is set up so that 70% of the time you see an A cue, that target cue, it's followed by an X probe, right? So this creates a bias that allows us to then probe people's control tendencies when their expectations aren't met, right? So for example, on AY trials, where the cue is valid, but the probe isn't, increased error rates and response times suggest a proactive strategy, right? So participants are more heavily relying on contextual cues. Conversely, on BX trials, where an invalid cue is followed by that target X probe, increased error rates and response times indicate a more reactive strategy, right? So participants experience a greater difficulty retrieving that cue when you see that X probe, okay? So how does performance on this task relate to bilingual picture naming? So these plots are showing how picture naming accuracy in both Spanish, the darker gray, and English in the lighter gray, how that performance differs as a function of participants' cognitive control recruitment strategies on the AXCPT. Remember, these bilinguals are the same as we saw before from the same context as the ERP study. They're highly proficient in the two languages, and they show no ERP differences when they process the two languages separately. Unsurprisingly here, we see that bilinguals were more accurate naming pictures in Spanish compared to English. But what's interesting is how lexical access in this task relates to their control engagement tendencies. So in the first plot, we didn't find a reliable association between picture naming and proactive control. But if you look at the second plot, what we did find was that a greater reliance on reactive control related to better picture naming in the two languages. Okay, and so what this suggests is that lexical access in these bilinguals with competitive experience may be influenced by these reactive control tendencies in a manner similar to what we saw when they were processing code switches in that earlier ERP study. So let's move on now to the other side. So let's look at cooperative context. So here we have a very different scenario, right? So in cooperative language context, bilinguals actively use more than one language, and switching between them is highly prevalent, and these switches reflect highly conventionalized community norms. If we look back at this graph, looking at code switching rates across bilingual communities, we can now focus on the last bar. So these data are from, again, highly proficient Spanish-English bilinguals from San Juan, Puerto Rico. You can see some examples of code switching from that community. And so based on this characterization of what I've been saying of how using the two languages in a more integrated way, we can start thinking about the ways in which more cooperative language experience may lead to a somewhat different path of adaptive change. So when we start thinking about this question, we first have to ask, why is it that bilinguals code switch? Right, and there are many possibilities out there, and depending also on what sorts of literature you are familiar with, and this may vary across bilingual communities, right? But first, let's consider the possibility that in situations where the two languages are well supported in the environment, code switching may serve as a tool to maximize communicative efficiency. So here's a quick illustration from a study that we did looking at habitual code switchers playing this game, in which they took turns describing visual scenes to each other. So you can see from the example, the scenes are very detailed and they included duplicate objects. So if you look closely, some objects are very similar. They just differ in color or in shape. For example, these two gloves that you see here. And this setup allowed us to see what language choices bilinguals will make to optimally refer to these duplicate items in particular. And so for context, you need to know that Spanish and English differ in their modification strategies. In English, adjectives are pre-nominalized. In Spanish, they're mostly post-nominal with some exceptions. And so we were interested in whether participants would capitalize on pre-nominalization to more efficiently disambiguate between duplicates. Now, this is in Puerto Rico, the predominant language is going to be Spanish, but in cases of these duplicate objects, we were interested, would the rates of unilingual English increase, or alternatively, would they opt to switch from Spanish into English, okay? Now, under a traditional psycholinguistic view of code switching, it's commonly assumed that switching languages is inherently more effortful than sticking to one language. And so we might expect that bilinguals would code switch less often with increasing competition. Yet, contrary to this prediction, what we observed in the study is that code switching rates actually increase when disambiguating between these competing references, when bilinguals were referring to these duplicate objects, okay? So it's in this sense that code switching is not some random between language interference, but rather an opportunistic strategy that could maximize communicative efficiency, okay? So now that we've discussed a potential reason why bilinguals may code switch, we can think of the implications of code switching experience for comprehension. And the argument here is that bilinguals who habitually use their languages cooperatively, code switches that adhere to their habitual usage patterns should not induce processing costs during comprehension. And so to test this, we go back to the ERP study I mentioned earlier, but this time these data come from not Spain, they come from State College, Pennsylvania, which is not the mecca of bilingualism, but I can assure you these participants were vetted that they came from habitual code switching communities. We have their production data that more or less mirror the tendencies, the switching patterns from places like Puerto Rico and other Caribbean varieties in contact with English. The task is exactly the same as I mentioned before. So we can look at the processing of their brain responses to unilingual sentences in Spanish and English. These are the translation equivalent sentences. And what we see here is exactly the same as we saw before with the Spain bilinguals, right? So when the languages are kept separate, there's no difference in the ERP response. So what happens when these bilinguals, these habitual code switchers, process code switches? So remember, this red line is technically the baseline. The switch doesn't occur until after the target noun. And here's the blue line. And you can see it's basically overlapping. There's no switch effect. There's no difference in processing. Now, one little detail that I forgot to mention is that in this particular experiment, we had different kinds of switches. And so the blue line here represents switches that adhere to participants' code switching patterns, right? Their conventions. But we also included a condition of a rarely attested switch, a switch that is not commonly observed in bilingual speech. And so we could ask the question, what happens if are all code switches just processed the same, or do these bilinguals show some sort of differential sensitivity to rarely attested code switches? And so here's what we observed. For rare code switches, we found an N400 effect, right? Suggesting that rare code switches are less expected and perhaps more difficult to integrate relative to the code switches that do adhere to their habitual usage patterns, right? And so this is actually a quite remarkable finding, right? Because we're showing that code switching is not more difficult to understand than unilingual speech, so long as the code switches actually conform to their usage patterns. Now, before I move on, I do want to reiterate that something very important here. Notice how even for the rare code switch, we don't find that early switch effect we had seen for the non-habitual switchers, the bilinguals from Spain, right? And so this lack of this early switch effect at early stages of processing is particularly noteworthy because it suggests that bilinguals' breadth of attention may be broadened to include both language networks. And so here's a special shout out from a study from your lab, which I think it was quite very ingenious design, where they paired habitual code switchers with different interlocutors. And so what the study found was that you can get habitual code switchers to show the early frontal positivity if they're in a situation where you shouldn't expect code switching. So for example, when you're interacting with a monolingual interlocutor, you have to be competitive. And so this is actually quite revealing because it demonstrates that cooperative language control is not a fixed type of response. Rather, it's a control state that depends on the demands of the conversation. So it's a really nice illustration of some of the more dynamic aspects of this. Okay, so now that we've established that experience with code switching influences language processing, we can think about the ways in which cooperative environments might mediate cognitive control engagement. Now, from a theoretical standpoint, because both languages are habitually used interchangeably, it's not necessary for bilinguals in code switching contexts to continuously monitor for the appropriate language, nor to adjust accordingly for each communicative interaction. It's a pretty homogeneous setting. It's just homogeneous with bilinguals. You're free to use the two languages, and the interactional cost of switching is low. Okay, so let's go back to that study looking at associations between the picture naming task and AXCBT. So these are the same plots that I showed before, the same associations, but now the sample comes from highly proficient bilinguals from Puerto Rico, so highly cooperative context. And so unlike for the bilinguals in competitive context, the bilinguals in Spain, here we don't see a reliable association between language use and either proactive or reactive control strategies. Okay, so one interpretation following everything that we've been talking about is that cooperative contexts are relatively less likely to mediate control demands based on this idea that the interactional cost is low. So there's definitely much more that we can do. The research is still at its very early stages, but the emerging picture suggests that this may be the case. And so this is an example of an MEG study by Blanco y Urrieta, where they compared two different kinds of language switching paradigms. On the one hand, you had your typical psycholinguistic cued language switching task where they name pictures in different languages depending on an external cue. And then another type of switching task, which was just listening to a natural bilingual conversation. And so what the study found was that while the laboratory-based cued switching task increased recruitment of conflict monitoring regions like the ACC and the prefrontal cortex, listening to naturalistic code switching did not. So rather than increasing demands on cognitive control, cooperative experiences may instead induce a more open control mode in which language membership is minimized and where resources from both languages are explored. Okay. So in our most recent work, we turned to pupillometry to test this interplay between narrow and broad attentional states. Just for some context, we know that pupil diameter closely correlates with this trade-off between exploration and exploitation as mediated by the locus coeruleus norepinephrine system. And so it's possible then that changes in pupil size could possibly index these language control states. And so we know that LC activity is driven by regions implicated in attention, such as the anterior cingulate and orbital frontal cortices. And particularly when faced with increasing demands, these regions relay conflict signals to the locus coeruleus, and this promotes greater engagement, and this results in increases in pupil size. So against this backdrop, this is the interesting prediction that we can make. If phasic responses are driven by these conflict signals that are relayed by these frontal regions, and we know that code switching bilinguals do not extraordinarily engage these regions during the comprehension of naturalistic code switch speech, thanks to that MEG study I mentioned earlier, we can predict pupil responses to differ as a function of bilinguals' habits of language control. So specifically, for people who tend to use their languages more competitively, code switches may be more effortful to process. Okay, thus these bilinguals may demonstrate a relatively greater pupil dilation to code switches compared to unilingual speech. However, with increasing cooperative language use, we might expect less engagement in these frontal regions and therefore less differences in sensitivity between code switching and unilingual speech. So to study this, we returned to Puerto Rico and we did a visual world paradigm where participants just listened to instructions to find one of the two objects on the screen. And the instructions were either unilingual in Spanish or they started in Spanish and they code switched to English. And so here I'm plotting the pupil response to the unilingual condition and to the code switch condition. This is a very large sample of highly proficient Spanish-English bilinguals from Puerto Rico. And when we look at everyone put together, here's what we get, right? So we could basically say, basically conclude here, code switching is costly. It's inherently more effortful to process relative to the unilingual condition, even in this community where we know we have all this evidence suggesting that code switching is very prevalent. And yet, fortunately, we didn't stop the study there. We know that based on the evidence that I've shown you thus far, and we know that there are boundary conditions for switching costs, and that not all bilinguals process code switches in the same way. And so we followed up on this main finding by adopting an individual differences approach to better understand the circumstances under which bilinguals may or may not show sensitivity to code switch speech. And so to this end, we relied on two different individual difference measures. The first one is the results from the test of everyday attention. This is an auditory attention task. Specifically, we use the elevator counting with reversal subtest. And so in this task, participants have to imagine they're in an elevator where the floor indicator is broken. And so instead, they hear tones representing the floor. And in this particular version, it's actually quite difficult because they're going to hear different pitch tones. If they hear a high-pitched tone, that signals that the elevator is going upwards, so they have to count the floors upwards. If they hear a low-pitched tone, that signals that the elevator is going down. They have to count downwards. This is a visual depiction of what a trial is like, but everything is auditorily presented. So in reality, the task is quite difficult, and it's really nice for us because we get a range of individual differences. So it's nowhere at ceiling. Some people are good in the task, some people do okay, and some people do very poorly. So it's an established measure of auditory attentional control. Our second individual difference measure is what I'm operationalizing here as language cooperativeness. This is just an item you can add to your language history questionnaire, and it takes a very broad approach to code switching, right? So some questions like to ask a typical self-report, do you code switch, like a Likert scale or something like that. My experience has been that people don't really know what this refers to, and so I just put it, like I like to say in Spanish, en arroz y habichuela. So very simple terms. When I speak with certain people in a given context, and we asked it across like the home, university, and leisure time, I use more than one language, right? So we're probing how are they opening up that language system. And so this was a Likert type scale response where lower values indicate greater language compartmentalization, keeping the language separate. Higher values indicate greater language integration, more cooperative language use. So how do these two measures relate to the pupil code switching effects that we saw earlier? So it turns out it's a complex interaction, and I'm going to break it down for you. Okay, so if we look at this graph here on the x-axis, we have time at the onset of that target noun, right? They were asked to find one of the objects and when the object was named. On the y-axis, we have the standardized attention score. So the higher the value, the better they did on that elevator task. And if we look at the legend, this represents the difference in the pupil response. And so the brighter the yellow, the larger the difference, and the higher the pupil cost for code switches relative to the unilingual condition. And so what we see here is that for those individuals who did really well on the auditory attention task, they're showing the largest pupil cost, right, to largest code switching cost in their pupil response. However, this is a complex interaction. How does cooperativeness play here? So what we're seeing here is really the pain, the visual pain at the lowest level of language cooperativeness. So this is actually a video. I'm going to play the animation of what happens to this effect as we increase cooperativeness, right? So these are the individuals who are keeping their languages separate. Okay, so I'm just going to play the animation here. Okay, I'll play it one more time. What we see is that it starts off with a really strong effect, and as we increase language cooperativeness, the effect attenuates and eventually goes away. right? So these results are quite remarkable because, again, they challenge these existing accounts that code switching is intrinsically effortful. What they instead reveal is how engagement of control processes during code switching depends on the ways in which bilinguals are using their languages. Now, to summarize what I've been talking about here we have an example of two different kinds of bilingual phenotypes. They're all highly proficient in the same two languages. In the previous literature, we would have simply aggregated these data and just said they're highly proficient Spanish-English bilinguals. We would have said that they're all the same. But what this research clearly shows is that they're not. Right? They differ by virtue of where they live and the demands that are placed on them to use each language. Okay, so in the time that I have left, I want to end with some important remarks based off, it's been some time since this framework of identifying bilingual phenotypes has been out, and so we've learned a couple lessons. So first off, I do want to make the point that geographical location is a good start, but it's certainly not free of shortcomings. Okay, so already in the last study, I showed you how in Puerto Rico, so the same context, the same language environment where Spanish and English are well supported and code switching is highly prevalent, there's significant variation in how bilinguals engage and interact with one another. And so I want to be clear that these bi-location comparisons are in many ways convenient. I myself like to refer to like Spain bilinguals, Puerto Rico bilinguals, that sort of thing. But we must not lose sight of the underlying issue, which is to identify what aspects of bilingual language experience lead to potentially different paths of adaptive change. So my second point here is that our goal is not to simply conclude that all bilingual experiences are different. We don't want to take it to the other extreme either. Our ultimate goal is to extrapolate the precise interactional demands that underlie differences in language processing outcomes and trajectories. So under this perspective, it's reasonable to assume that different forms of language experience may ultimately lead to similar adaptive responses. And so I'm just going to quickly showcase three different kinds of interactional experiences that have been linked to greater proactive control reliance. Okay, and I'm going to illustrate with the example of variable context. That's the name we could sort of use to characterize all three of them. So let's start off with the case of L2 immersion. So in our own work, we've previously looked at Spanish-English bilinguals in the US who previously came from predominantly Spanish-speaking countries. And so this population is very interesting to look at because some bilinguals are going to maintain L1 dominance while others are going to become more dominant in their L2. And so this variation in L1 performance is depicted here, right? So we're looking again at the association of picture naming and that AXCPT performance task, and these data are from L2 immersed Spanish-English bilinguals, okay? And so what we found in this example here is that greater AY errors, so those participants who relied heavily on that context, that AQ and the AXCPT task, greater AY errors related to higher picture naming accuracy in that L1 in Spanish. And that's not all. It turns out that it's not just reliance on contextual cues, it's also bilinguals' ability to resolve that interference. So here we see that these Spanish-English bilinguals who showed less of a difference between these AY trials and the control condition, they were more accurate in naming in the native language. Right, so this all supports current claims in the literature that L2 immersion may bring about changes in the relative support for each language, therefore introducing a stronger pressure for regulating that L1. So that's just one example. Here's the second example. Here, we're no longer talking about L2 immersion, but highly diverse, linguistically diverse contexts. So these are the cases of multilingual contexts where there's greater contextual diversity in language use. You can think of places like French-English bilinguals in Montreal, bilinguals in Singapore, and places like that. Right, so in the case of Montreal, you can have a French-English bilingual sometimes speak only French with the Francophone population, or only English with others, or maybe both, depending on the interlocutor. And so the case in point here is that these bilinguals experience a greater variety of the kinds of conversational exchanges relative to those in more linguistically homogeneous settings. And so I won't get into the details of this other work. I'm sure you're familiar with the work by Jason Gullifer in Montreal, and there's other people in Singapore as well. But again, what we see is that bilinguals in these highly linguistically diverse contexts show a greater reliance on proactive control processes. And then the third example is that even for bilinguals in L1 immersion context, there's some evidence that if you submit bilinguals to intensive language switching training in the lab, you can also see very similar proactive control associations. So here you have a glimpse of three very different experiences with different language pairs. The commonality across these studies is that bilinguals must adapt to flexibly attend to a broader range of contextual cues, and they have to regulate that activation of both languages to navigate this more complex landscape. So that's point number two. My third point today is that all of this is well and done, but our understanding of adaptive change is only as good as the tools we use to measure it. And so over the past couple of years, several exciting metrics have been developed in an attempt to characterize diversity in language experience. But I'm going to argue that such tools need to be adequately contextualized for effective phenotyping. Here's a quick illustration. I'm happy to talk more about this study during the Q&A if you're interested. We looked at declines in cognitive control as in an aging population. So this is a lifespan sample of adult bilingual women in Montreal, French-English bilingual women in Montreal. And as you can see, performance on the cognitive task goes down with increasing age. If we look at the relation of language entropy, which is a measure of linguistic diversity in different contexts. We looked at language entropy in the home context and language entropy in the work environment. And what you see is that there are different associations depending on the diversity of these contexts. So in the home environment, you can see there's no difference. Home entropy does not modulate these declines, the relation of age and cognitive control performance. What we instead see here is it's work entropy that matters, right? And so, it kind of buffers these age-related declines in cognitive control. And so what's happening here? Not all interactional demands are the same. So the rationale here is that in the home environment, language choice is presumably under full control of the speaker, whereas in the workplace, there are higher order regional policies on language protection and promotion. In Montreal, it's very strict, right? That sometimes you have to use French, only in some other cases you can use English. And so the point here is that there's a distinction between internally mediated and externally mediated communicative demands, right? And so this is just a quick illustration. We're scratching the surface here, but you can just see how increased diversity of language use in the workplace, but critically not in the home environment, modulates these age-related declines in cognitive control. So it's really, we need to do more to see how these communicative demands are mediated by higher order social norms. And then here's my final point. I'm going to emphasize the need for characterizing interpersonal dynamics beyond traditional measures of general language use. Okay, so myself included, we're all guilty of using these very general metrics of language exposure and language use in very general terms in our language history questionnaires. Unfortunately, a lot of these questions fall short at capturing important interpersonal nuances. So here, just for the sake of illustration, let's take the case of these two Spanish-English bilinguals. They both report using each language about 50% of the time. So you'll get 50-50 in your traditional language history questionnaire metric. But if you look at their interpersonal dynamics, they're quite different. So for bilingual number one, this is a habitual code switcher. This person is surrounded by other people in their network who are similarly bilingual. For bilingual number two, on the other hand, it lives in a more competitive context. At the interpersonal level, you see how the two languages are compartmentalized, right? And so what I would like to argue is that we need to go a step beyond these general assessments. They're great, but it may not be the full picture, and focus instead on characterizing the interpersonal level, right? How different contexts of language use and the demands they place on speakers may modulate these effects at the interpersonal level. So here's some examples of things that we're currently working on in our lab. So you can see examples here of a bilinguals network. So let's use red to mean that the person, the white circle, is talking to everyone in Spanish. So red for Spanish. Here's an example of another linguistically homogeneous network, but this time let's use purple for code switching, just using Spanish and English, both languages across different people. And then here's an example of a more heterogeneous network, right? So let's use blue for English, right? So this is just a quick sample of differences, different networks that you can find across Spanish-English bilinguals. And it turns out that these come from different communities, but you can also see important variability within communities. So here are some examples from Spain, Puerto Rico, and Southern California, right? So people, again, presumably the same sample of highly proficient Spanish-English bilinguals, but they're using their languages differently across the people and contexts that they live in. Okay, so I'd like to start wrapping up today with just a couple take-home points. The first one is about variation. It's commonly assumed that variation is just noise, but I see it as signal, right? A source of insight. We know we've seen now with code switching, for example, that not all bilinguals habitually switch, but those who do, they conform to community norms, and this has non-trivial consequences for comprehension. We've learned that bilinguals differ depending on where they live and how they're using their languages, and therefore research on bilingualism needs to be adequately contextualized, right? We need to characterize those communicative demands of different contexts, and we need to place the lived experiences of people center stage. And then the last point is I want to return to the transdisciplinary argument and say that it takes a village to do this work, right? We need to increase variety, not for its own sake, but because it opens up new avenues of discovery. Okay, so on that note, I want to say muchas gracias. Thank you. Here's a picture of my wonderful new lab, and I'm excited to take your questions. Thank you.